There are two sides to akathisia. One is outer visible restlessness that you can observe, but the other, much more important one, is an extraordinary state of terror inside a person. Psychiatric drugs were used by the Soviet Union in the Gulag, large doses of them, to induce this side effect, and it was a form of torture. And if you talk to patients, it is torture. You can have mild, moderate, or severe restlessness, but this inner subjective agitation has been described as abject terror, anxiety, tension. That's what you heard Kim describing Woody with his hands to his head, saying he didn't know what was going on in him. Patients have described it to me and in the literature as being like listening to nails scratching on a blackboard 24/7, or your bones rattling like tuning forks. And it's this inner agitation that's by far the most severe, the most dangerous. It's been described, this is a quote from 1958, ladies and gentlemen, more difficult to endure than any of the symptoms for which patients were originally treated with the drugs. It's been described as behavioral toxicity of antidepressants. This is SSRIs, 1992, after the FDA hearing in 1991. And the way that suicidality emerges in this picture is one of two ways. For some patients, suicide becomes a way of escaping this side effect, literally, like death would be a welcome relief. And for other patients, it seems that as part of the syndrome, they actually develop an obsessive preoccupation with suicide. And I've talked to people who lived to describe this. The most vulnerable time period has been known in the literature for decades, early in treatment. FDA doesn't disagree with that now. And it's distinctly different from the suicidality of depression. When people get this side effect, they will tell you they want to kill themselves to escape this severe inner agitation. They feel like jumping out of their skin. They feel like jumping off a building. They feel like jumping off a roof or hanging themselves. When people are depressed, they're hopeless, helpless, worthless, and that's what they'll tell you they want to escape. It looks totally different, and the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA saying, well, how could you ever tell this apart from depression, is just completely misleading. We know how to treat akathisia. We understand the brain chemistry of why it's more likely to occur with SSRIs. Primary care doctors who write 70% of prescriptions for antidepressants know almost nothing about this side effect, and FDA is still not educating them. I'll show you that a little further along. And akathisia can in turn cause most of the other side effects on the FDA's list of the side effects that make people worse. For example, worsening insomnia. Akathisia makes people profoundly anxious. It can make them quite paranoid. In the mid-90s, again, my historical march, you get up to 1994, and the test case went to trial. It was in Louisville, Kentucky. It was a man who used an AK-47 automatic rifle to kill 8 people, wound 12 others, and then a handgun to kill himself. Lilly appeared to win a jury verdict in 1994. In actual fact, several years later, through the heroism of the judge in the case fighting Lilly, it turned out that Lilly had secretly settled the case, and the verdict was later changed to dismissed as settled. All of this is spelled out in Prozac Backlash and other publications on this. Testimony in the West Becker trial said that data was massaged by Lilly, that sedatives were heavily used to offset this anxiety and agitation, that when people became suicidal, Lilly coded it as depression. We now know that GlaxoSmithKline coded it as emotional lability, which is like being very emotional, kind of crying one minute and laughing the next. You have people like Dr. Peter Brigham in 1994 publishing Talking Back to Prozac and revealing a lot of this. My book came out in 2000. Dr. Healy, as was said earlier, has published numerous books and articles. The one I'm highlighting here is his landmark study in 2000 of healthy volunteers on Zoloft, where I believe it's 10% of them became suicidal. These were healthy volunteers, dismissing the pharmaceutical argument that, well, it's just depression. This is clearly described in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, since 2000. Here's other textbooks, including American Psychiatric Association textbook of psychopharmacology, clearly describing SSRIs causing akathisia and akathisia making people suicidal. More textbooks that I'm just going to flip through, but to give you a feel for this has not come out of the blue. This has been well known for years and years, and FDA has not taken adequate protection. There have been lawsuits, many, many lawsuits, secretly settled. It's a shame that we are discussing this issue with so many of the documents still confidential. We're only able to talk to you about the documents that have become public in the few cases where the lawyers were able to make that happen, either because they went to trial or because they used legal means to try and force some of the documents out. But it's a crime that we are discussing this without all the documents being public, given the public health and safety issues involved. In those suits, experts for the pharmaceutical industry have acknowledged that akathisia is a risk factor for suicide. Look at the data on that, 2000, well before the FDA's next hearing in 2004. Here's another expert for Pfizer. In 2001, we had the landmark Tobin case in Wyoming. This was a murder-suicide, a man who went on Paxil and within days murdered his wife, his daughter, his granddaughter, and then committed suicide. The only one in the family who survived was his son-in-law. He brought a lawsuit, and it was an $8 million jury verdict. It was the first jury verdict. It got a lot of documents into the public record, as had the Westbecker trial. Come up to 2002, 2003, the developments in the UK, and I really want to impress upon you, as journalists, that the impetus for everything that has happened since 2003 has not come from FDA, and it has not come from the British regulators. It came from the media. And it was the BBC ran two very hard-hitting exposés in 2002 and 2003 on Paxil causing severe withdrawal and suicide. And it's very unfortunate. I know journalists in this country who tried to run those kind of shows and they couldn't, and I'm convinced that it was because of the influence of advertising on television in this country. The BBC doesn't have to deal with that. That put a lot of pressure on the British regulators, who formed a committee to look at this, much like the FDA does. The first committee was riddled with conflict of interest, public humiliation for the British regulators, and had to be disbanded. This is the second of the two exposés. New committee started looking at this just when the data on children taking these antidepressants was brought into the regulators. The companies, if they can show that the drugs work in children, get a 6-month extension on the patent for everyone, which is worth an absolute fortune. So that's why the pediatric data was coming in 2002, 2003. So there's a spotlight in England on the companies and this side effect. The pediatric data came in, and the committee, the new committee, much cleaner committee, was asked to look at it and said, oh my gosh, there's a 3-fold statistically significant increase in suicidality in children taking this drug. The British, by the late 2003, had instituted a virtual ban on SSRIs for children because the British factor in efficacy. There isn't proven benefit of antidepressants for children. Everyone knows that. The one exception is a study of Prozac. There are all kinds of problems with that study. If you take the aggregate for kids with antidepressants, and I can tell you why later in the question and answer if you're particularly interested in that, but there isn't proven efficacy, and the British weighed. Why would you give kids drugs that could cause this kind of deadly suicide side effect if you haven't proven any efficacy? FDA doesn't do that. They don't weigh the two.